Jasmine Carter thought her walk toward the police station would be just another day, until she crossed paths with a group of firefighters. Their mockery cut deep, and as one of them stepped forward, ready to humiliate her further, she realized the terrible truth. They weren't just teasing her. They were exploiting her vulnerability. But what they didn't know was that her father, Ethan Carter, was not just any man. He was the captain of the local police, and no one, especially not the men who thought they could get away with bullying, was going to hurt her and walk away free. But before we dive into Jasmine's journey, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss our next gripping tale. Jasmine Carter is a bright and ambitious 15-year-old girl raised in the heart of a close-knit community. Her father, Ethan Carter, serves as the captain of the local police department, a position of great respect and responsibility. To Jasmine, her father has always been a hero, someone who embodies strength, honor, and unwavering dedication to the greater good. She is proud of the work he does, even though it often keeps him away from home. Despite the sacrifices their family has made, Jasmine has grown up with a deep sense of admiration for her father's role in maintaining the peace. In their small suburban town, Ethan is well known. People greet him with respect, often stopping to shake his hand or wave when they see him around. Jasmine, for the most part, is content in the shadows of his professional life. She doesn't mind. After all, the town respects her father, and in turn she feels an overwhelming sense of pride every time someone mentions his name. Yet there is a part of Jasmine that yearns to step out of the shadows, to feel like she has her own identity beyond just being Captain Carter's daughter. As she approaches her teenage years, she starts to feel the weight of expectations bearing down on her, not just from her father but from the world around her. But today is different. Today, Jasmine is walking with an unusual sense of anticipation in her chest. It's a crisp autumn afternoon, the wind rustling through the trees, sending golden leaves dancing through the air. The familiar sound of her sneakers hitting the pavement fills the quiet spaces of her thoughts as she walks toward the police station, a small but thoughtful gift tucked safely under her arm. She's been saving up for this moment, eager to surprise her father. My dad is a hero, Jasmine thinks, her heart swelling with pride as she walks through the neighborhood she's known her whole life. He always stands for what's right. I want to be just like him someday, strong, brave. Her mother doesn't think it's right to pass judgment. She told Jasmine fairy tales, often when she was young. Her thoughts drift back to when she was younger. She remembers the days when she would follow him around the house, mimicking his movements, pretending to take on the role of a police officer like him. She recalls how she would sit quietly, listening to his stories about his work, feeling her chest puff up with admiration every time someone mentioned his name. She knew that being the daughter of a man like Ethan Carter came with its own set of expectations, but Jasmine had always felt proud of the responsibility it carried. But now, as she grows older, Jasmine is beginning to sense a shift in herself, a shift in how she sees the world, how she sees her father, and perhaps how she sees her place in it all. She still wants to make him proud, to live up to the legacy he's built, but there's an undeniable feeling tugging at her heart, one that tells her that the world she's grown comfortable in is about to change. Today she's excited to surprise him, but underneath that excitement there's a quiet voice whispering in the back of her mind, a voice she's not sure she wants to hear. It's telling her that something is coming, something that will challenge her understanding of the world of justice and of who she really is. It's a small inkling, but it's enough to make her hesitate for a moment. But she shakes it off, her excitement growing once again as she reaches the intersection. Today, everything feels lighter, as if the wind is carrying her hopes with it. She feels connected to her father in a way she hasn't felt before, as if she's not just his daughter, but someone who can one day walk beside him, strong and confident. I can't wait to see the look on his face, Jasmine thinks, a smile tugging at her lips. He's going to love this. Little does she know, the day she's anticipating will be the day that changes everything. As Jasmine neared the intersection, her thoughts were still wrapped in the excitement of her surprise for her father. But as she rounded the corner, her gaze fell on something that made her pause. A large fire truck was parked on the side of the road, and a group of firefighters stood in a loose circle, their loud, boisterous laughter echoing down the street. The sound felt out of place in the quiet of the autumn afternoon, like an unwelcome storm rolling in. At first, Jasmine tried to dismiss them. She'd passed by this same group many times before, and their presence usually didn't bother her. But today, something felt different. Her nerves prickled as she hesitated, her eyes flickering over to them. They seemed so carefree, so loud, so entirely disconnected from the world around them. Jasmine knew they didn't belong here in the same way she did. She was the daughter of a respected man, someone who stood for justice and right. They were just a rowdy bunch. They don't look so bad. Maybe if I keep my head down, they'll just leave me alone, she thought, pushing the anxiety that was creeping up her spine back into the recesses of her mind. But as she tried to walk past them without drawing attention, one of the firefighters caught her eye. He was taller than the rest, with a crooked smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey there, little lady. Where are you rushing off to? Got an important meeting?" Firefighter 1's voice sliced through the air, dripping with sarcasm. His tone made Jasmine's stomach flip, but she forced herself to keep walking, her steps quickening, trying to ignore him. She thought that might be enough. "Just keep walking, Jasmine," she told herself. "They won't bother you if you don't give them a reason." But the question hung in the air like a storm cloud, and she felt the weight of their eyes following her. The laughter grew louder, harsher, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being cornered, like an animal under siege. Her breath caught in her throat. She was already feeling the sting of their gazes, but she knew she had to say something. Anything. She needed to keep walking, keep moving forward. With a steadying breath, Jasmine turned slightly to face them, standing a little taller despite the nerves gnawing at her. "I'm going to see my dad," she said, trying to make her voice strong, but even to her own ears it sounded small. The laughter stopped for a brief moment, and then, like a crack of thunder, their mockery erupted. "Oh yeah? Who's your dad? Some important guy in town?" Firefighter 2 sneered, his grin growing wider, more vicious. Jasmine's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white. Her heart was pounding now, her excitement quickly giving way to an unfamiliar unease. She tried to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. They were just words, she told herself, but they felt like daggers, each one sharper than the last. As she straightened her back, she felt the lump of fear lodge in her throat, but she pushed it down. "My dad is Ethan, the police captain," she said, voice shaking but firm. The reaction was instant. Their laughter exploded again, louder this time, like a chorus of cruel voices mocking her. Firefighter 3 leaned against the fire truck, his eyes narrowed with disdain. "The police captain's daughter? What a joke," he sneered, his words punctuated by the snickers of the others. Jasmine's pulse quickened. Her pride, her reason for walking in the first place, all felt so small now. What was meant to be a proud moment, a connection with her father, was quickly turning into something else. The weight of their laughter pushed against her chest, suffocating her. "Please, just leave me alone," she thought, desperately, but the words never left her mouth. Instead, she felt the sting of shame settle deep in her bones. But that was just the beginning. As Jasmine straightened her back and took a deep breath, she tried to muster the courage to answer. Her voice wavered slightly, but she pushed through the fear that churned in her chest. "My dad is Ethan, the police captain," she said, trying to hold on to her dignity. She had to stand tall for her father, for herself. The effect was immediate and jarring. The moment the words left her lips, the firefighter's laughter erupted like a thunderclap. It wasn't just a burst of amusement. It was cruel, unrelenting, as if her declaration had been an open invitation for mockery. The sound hit her like a slap to the face, and for a second she couldn't breathe. Their laughter rippled through the air, growing louder and sharper. A storm of voices that didn't just laugh at her, but tore through her very sense of self. "Oh, really?" Firefighter 2 sneered, his grin widening like a predator spotting prey. He leaned in closer, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "The police captain's daughter, huh? Big shot." He made exaggerated air quotes with his fingers, mocking her every word. Jasmine's stomach twisted, the knot of anxiety tightening. She had tried to hold her ground, but the weight of their derision pressed down on her. The other firefighters joined in, their cruel laughter rising in volume. One by one, their eyes locked onto her, and it felt like their glares were piercing through her, dissecting her every move. The group was relentless, a pack of hyenas circling their prey. Firefighter 1, the one who had first spoken to her, grinned darkly. He took a step forward, his body language menacing. "The police captain's little girl thinks she's important." His voice was mocking, but there was something more dangerous in it, a simmering contempt that chilled Jasmine to the bone. He paused for a beat, watching her with amusement, before adding, "What do you think, boys? Is she really worth the attention of the great Captain Ethan?" The other firefighters chuckled, egging him on. Their laughter was sharp, cutting through the air. Jasmine could feel her cheeks burning, not from embarrassment, but from the viciousness of their words. Her pride, the very thing she had been walking toward her father to share, felt like it was being torn apart in front of her eyes. Firefighter 3, who had been silent until now, took a step forward, sneering as he leaned in. "What's the matter, kid?" His voice was venomous. "Did your daddy teach you how to be tough, or is that just for show?" The laughter grew louder, almost deafening. They closed the circle around her, trapping her in their mockery. Jasmine's hands balled into fists at her sides, but she was shaking now. The cold air didn't help, nor did the stinging sensation in her chest that made it hard to breathe. Each insult felt like another slap, another reminder that her father's reputation, her whole identity, was being ripped apart by these strangers. The more she tried to stand tall, the more they seemed to feed off her discomfort, pushing her deeper into helplessness. Firefighter 1's voice rose above the rest, his words hitting her like a wave. "What's the matter, princess? Can't handle a little fun? Maybe you should go home. Tell daddy his daughter's got no backbone." Jasmine felt small. She felt powerless. All the pride she'd carried into this moment, the love and admiration for her father, felt like it was shattering into pieces. The firefighters' laughter rang in her ears, louder and louder, until it drowned out everything else. As Firefighter 3 sneered, his words cutting through the air like a knife, Jasmine felt her stomach twist into a tight knot. The police captain's daughter? What a joke. His voice was laced with contempt, and it struck her harder than she had anticipated. The weight of the insult hit her like a physical blow, making her falter mid-step. For a brief moment, she felt the world around her blur, as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her pride, which had been so strong just moments before, felt fragile, like glass shattering under the weight of their laughter. Every ounce of joy she had felt about seeing her father, about being proud of who he was, seemed to slip through her fingers. The moment she had dreamed about, the moment she had imagined would bring them closer together, now felt like a distant memory, fading as their mocking laughter grew louder. The laughter was sharp, cruel, echoing in her ears. It reverberated through her chest, each burst of it feeling like a hammer blow to her confidence. Jasmine's heart began to race. She could hear the bitterness in their voices, the disdain, the judgment. It was as if they weren't just mocking her, but everything she had believed in, everything she had held dear. The image of her father, her hero, was now tainted by their ridicule. She had always imagined her connection with him as something unbreakable, something strong. But as the mocking words washed over her, she felt that connection slipping into something she couldn't quite grasp. The proud girl who had once walked confidently toward the police station now felt small and insignificant under the weight of their cruelty. Her feet suddenly felt heavy, as if they were glued to the pavement. Jasmine's mind raced, her thoughts jumbled. She wanted to say something, to defend her father, to defend herself, but the words stuck in her throat. The shame pressed down on her chest, and her body trembled despite herself. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. The cold knot in her stomach grew tighter, and she tried to breathe, but it was hard to fill her lungs. Her heart beat faster, the pulse pounding in her ears. The laughter still echoed around her, and she couldn't escape it. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, but instead she stood there, frozen, unable to move, caught in the tide of their mockery. They had taken something from her, something that had once been so pure and strong, and turned it into something unrecognizable. The pride she had felt for her father felt like a distant echo now, drowned out by the cruel words and the twisted expressions of the firefighters. The laughter that had already filled the air now seemed to grow darker, more malicious, as one of the firefighters, a taller man with a cruel smirk, stepped forward. His eyes gleamed with a wicked intent, a glimmer that sent an icy chill down Jasmine's spine. He looked down at her, his grin widening as he reached for the hose lying on the truck. A casual, yet deliberate movement. With a practiced hand, he grabbed the nozzle and turned it toward her, his fingers tightening around the hose like a predator preparing to strike. Jasmine froze, her eyes widening in shock as she realized what was about to happen. "No! No! No!" her mind screamed, but the words never left her lips. She took a step back, instinctively trying to create some distance between herself and the fireman, but the act felt futile. The man's grip on the hose was unrelenting, and his malicious smile deepened as he aimed it directly at her. "Let's see how tough the police captain's daughter really is," Firefighter once said, his voice dark with amusement, his tone dripped with venom, and Jasmine felt her stomach twist painfully. "I'm sure she can take a little cold water, right?" Jasmine's breath caught in her throat, panic rising within her chest. She had thought the mocking words would be the worst of it, but this was something entirely different. The fear that had been growing steadily in her had now become a full-on rush, her heart racing as the cold metal of the hose seemed to press against her like an iron fist. She could already imagine the icy water blasting against her skin, the shock of it, the humiliation. Without thinking, she stumbled back another step, her voice trembling with desperation. "Please, I just want to pass by," she pleaded, her words barely above a whisper. But they were lost in the storm of laughter that erupted around her. Firefighter 2 chuckled darkly, his eyes gleaming with enjoyment as he watched Jasmine's body language falter. "Aw, come on, princess," he mocked. "Don't tell me you're scared of a little water. It's not like we're asking you to do something hard." Jasmine's chest tightened, her heart hammering in her ribcage. She tried to keep her feet planted to stand tall, but her legs felt like jelly. She was shaking, trying desperately to hold herself together, but the fear was suffocating, the weight of their eyes on her unbearable. Her body was screaming at her to run, but she knew that would only make it worse. She wasn't sure what to do, how to escape the spotlight they had forced her into. Before she could react, the firefighters squeezed the nozzle, and a powerful blast of cold water shot out, striking her chest with full force. The shock of the impact stole the breath from her lungs, and she gasped, her hands instinctively flying up to shield her face. But it was no use. The cold water drenched her instantly, the frigid spray seeping through her clothes, making her shiver uncontrollably. Her feet slipped on the wet pavement, and for a moment she was sure she was going to fall. The laughter from the firefighters only grew louder as Jasmine's body trembled under the relentless spray. She fought to stay standing, but the cold, unrelenting force of the water made it nearly impossible. Her eyes squeezed shut, tears mixing with the spray as she tried to shield herself, but the force of it knocked her back again. Every inch of her was soaked, her clothes clinging to her skin as her body shuddered against the freezing blast. "Please, stop, I can't!" Her voice cracked and the words barely made it past her lips before the water continued its assault. It felt like she was drowning in humiliation, the laughter of the firefighters ringing in her ears, each laugh a stab to her heart. Jasmine didn't understand why they were doing this. She hadn't done anything to deserve it. She was just trying to get to her father. But in this moment, she felt completely powerless, trapped in the whirlpool of their cruelty, unable to escape. The cruel laughter of the firefighters seemed to echo off the buildings, getting louder and more malicious with every passing second. Firefighter 2, his grin widening with each taunt, couldn't hide the satisfaction in his eyes as he watched Jasmine flinch under their gaze. "Don't be such a baby, it's just water," he mocked, his voice dripping with contempt. His words struck Jasmine like a slap, each syllable a reminder of her helplessness. Before she could even process the full meaning of his words, the firefighter twisted the nozzle of the hose with practiced ease. The sound of water rushing through the line filled the air, and then, with a swift yank, the blast came. The icy jet of water hit Jasmine square in the chest, knocking the breath from her lungs. She gasped, her body recoiling instinctively, but it was no use. Her feet slipped on the wet pavement, and she stumbled backward, her arms flailing in a desperate attempt to keep her balance. But the force of the water was too much. Her legs gave out, and she fell to the ground, the cold, unrelenting spray still hammering against her. Her heart pounded in her ears, but it was drowned out by the roar of the water crashing against her skin. Her body shuddered uncontrollably, the freezing water soaking through her clothes, seeping down to her bones. It felt like the very air was being knocked out of her, and she couldn't find a way to escape the biting cold that surrounded her. Every inch of her felt like ice, her skin stinging as the water pummeled her relentlessly. Her hands shot up instinctively to shield her face, but it was futile. The water wasn't stopping, and neither was their laughter. Jasmine's voice, barely a whisper beneath the roaring cascade of water, trembled as she cried out, her throat constricting with fear and desperation. "Please stop! I can't breathe!" Her words barely reached the firefighters above the chaos of their laughter and the roar of the spray. She could feel the cold grip on her chest tightening, but the laughter only grew louder, mocking her plea. Firefighter 1, his cruel grin widening at the sight of her distress, leaned in closer. His voice was dripping with venom as he spoke. "What's the matter? You're the daughter of the tough police captain, aren't you?" He let out a low chuckle, his eyes gleaming with wicked satisfaction. "Show us how tough you really are." Jasmine's chest tightened in fear, her body shaking from both the cold and the humiliation. The water was unrelenting, pounding against her with no mercy, stinging her skin as if it were trying to strip away her dignity piece by piece. The pain of the cold was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the sting of their words, the mocking, the derision. Her body felt small and insignificant beneath their cruel gaze. Her mind screamed at her to get up, to fight back, but she couldn't. She could barely keep herself from falling again as her legs trembled beneath her. Helen bolted forward, arms out, and slammed her hand into the wall. She tried to shield herself with her hands, but the water poured over her in waves, and every time she tried to block it, it only seemed to get worse. The firefighters' laughter rang out like knives in her heart, their amusement growing with every second that passed. Jasmine's body was shaking uncontrollably now, her clothes clinging to her skin as she trembled in the freezing blast. She wanted to hide, to escape, to run and find her father, but all she could do was stand there, frozen, in the face of their cruelty. Her voice, strained and broken, finally broke free from her trembling lips. "Please, I don't understand why—" "Boragua," Her words were desperate, filled with confusion and pain, but they were drowned out by the roar of the water, the laughter, and the jeers. Jasmine's heart was racing now, but her mind felt distant, as if she were floating outside of her own body. The world around her seemed to blur, the ground beneath her feet seeming farther and farther away as she felt herself slipping into the nightmare. The water felt endless, as if it were consuming her, drowning her in humiliation. She could no longer tell where the cold water ended and the pain of their mockery began. Her tears mixed with the spray, but they didn't matter to the firefighters. They didn't care that she was crying, that her body was trembling, that she was desperate for them to stop. All they saw was a target, a child they could torment, a vulnerable girl they could break with the power of their words and the force of the water. As the moments dragged on, Jasmine felt her strength start to wane. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being proud of her father, of the legacy he had built. But in this moment, standing before these men who had taken that pride and shredded it, she felt smaller than she ever had before. The water seemed to take more from her than just her warmth. It was taking her confidence, her sense of self, leaving her with nothing but the sting of their cruelty and the bitter taste of humiliation. The firefighters' laughter still rang in her ears, loud and sharp, as if it would never stop. The world felt distant now, as if she were trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. The only thing that remained was the cold, the laughter, and the feeling of her heart breaking slowly, piece by piece. Jasmine's steps were unsteady as she made her way to the police station, her body trembling from more than just the cold. The frigid water had seeped into her bones, numbing her physical senses, but it was the deep, burning shame that twisted inside her, making her feel small and exposed. Her skin felt raw from the freezing spray. Her clothes clung to her like a constant reminder of the humiliation she had endured, and with each step, her heart ached more. She had imagined this moment so many times, the joy of surprising her father, the pride she'd feel when handing him the small gift she had carefully chosen for him. But now, all of that seemed so far away. A cruel dream lost in the wake of the torment she had faced. The town that had once felt like home now seemed like a foreign place, filled with shadows and echoes of cruel laughter. She couldn't understand why it had happened, why the firefighters had done this. What did I do to deserve this? But the shame didn't stop her from moving forward. She was trembling, every step a reminder of how alone she felt, how vulnerable she was in this moment. No one had stepped in to help her. No one had come to her aid when she'd pleaded with them to stop. The very people who were supposed to protect the town, people like her father, had stood by and done nothing. In the moments when she had needed strength, she had found none. Only mockery and cruelty. Where was the justice? She could hear their laughter still ringing in her ears, but the only thing that mattered now was getting to her father. The door to the station was heavy, but her fingers fumbled with the handle as she pushed it open, her body still shaking violently from the cold. Inside, the warmth of the building didn't seem to reach her. It felt like a distant, unreachable thing. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her as she stepped into the lobby, the scent of coffee and paperwork hanging in the air. It should have been a safe place, a sanctuary, but now it felt like another world entirely, one where she no longer belonged. "Dad?" Jasmine's voice was barely a whisper as she spoke, her words thick with the emotions she could barely contain. It was a fragile sound, fragile as the hope that had led her here. But it carried the weight of everything she had just gone through. Her father's eyes shot up from his desk, the look of shock in his gaze immediately settling on her. His heart seemed to stop as he took in the sight of his daughter, soaked, trembling, and utterly defeated. The warmth of the room was no match for the cold that clung to her, and the vulnerability in her posture made his breath catch in his throat. His mind raced. What had happened? Ethan's instincts kicked in immediately. He stood up quickly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and rushed toward her, his face full of concern and confusion. There was no time to ask questions. He needed to get to her, to make sure she was okay. As he reached her, Jasmine collapsed into his arms, the floodgates of her emotions finally breaking open. Her body shook uncontrollably, her sobs coming in jagged bursts. She could barely breathe, the shame and the fear still choking her, overwhelming her. She didn't even realize how hard she was clutching onto him, as though she were afraid he might disappear. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into the warmth of his chest. His heart raced, his mind spinning with questions. What happened? Who did this to her? He could feel her trembling against him, and it pained him to see her so broken, so vulnerable. His protective instincts, those that he had honed over years of service as a police officer, kicked into full gear. But the shock on his face was impossible to hide. "Jasmine," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "What happened? Who did this to you?" His hands gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing against her wet cheeks, trying to wipe away the tears that wouldn't stop flowing. Jasmine's words were muffled as she broke down completely, the weight of everything she had been holding inside coming crashing to the surface. She struggled to get the words out, her voice cracked with emotion. It was the firefighters, Dad." She took a shaky breath, and another sob racked her body. "They sprayed me with water. They laughed at me. They humiliated me." Ethan's grip tightened around her as the reality of what she had just said sank in. The firefighters? His mind raced, anger bubbling up from deep within him. These were the very people who were supposed to protect their community, who were supposed to help when people were in need. But they had turned on his daughter, and not just with words. No, they had assaulted her, using the very thing they had at their disposal, the fire truck, the hose, to break her spirit. The thought of it made his blood boil. His heart ached for her, for the girl he had always seen as strong, who now stood before him, broken and vulnerable. He could feel his own anger rising, but at that moment, all he wanted to do was comfort her. "Jasmine," he whispered, his voice shaking with the depth of his emotion. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you had to go through that." His words were filled with a promise. He wouldn't let this go. He wouldn't allow his daughter to suffer like this, not in silence, not without justice. Jasmine clung to him, her body racked with sobs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel safe. In her father's arms, she knew she was finally home. As Jasmine's sobs quieted into soft, broken breaths, Ethan's mind churned with the weight of her words. The firefighters. His grip on her tightened, but his eyes were fixed on the floor. His jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ground together. Every word she spoke was like a blow to his chest, and with each detail, his heart sank deeper into the pit of something he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just a violation of his daughter's dignity, and he'd tried not to think about it till now, but no, this was something far more profound. A betrayal by those he had trusted, those who were supposed to protect and serve. The thought of it made his stomach churn. He had spent years teaching Jasmine about justice, about what was right and wrong. He had told her time and time again that the law was meant to protect everyone, especially those who needed it most. But now, the very people who were supposed to be her protectors had twisted that very ideal into something ugly, something that tore at the core of their community. The very firefighters he had trusted, men he had known, respected even, had reduced his daughter to a target of their mockery and violence. He had worked so hard to ensure his family would always be safe, that Jasmine would grow up in a world where she felt secure. But now, it felt as though the foundation he had built his life upon was cracking beneath him. Jasmine had been the one to suffer, and the guilt washed over him like a tidal wave. He should have been there. He should have been the one to step in, to protect her from this. As a police officer, he had sworn an oath to serve and protect, to shield those under his care from harm. But today, that oath had felt like a hollow promise. Jasmine had been alone, humiliated, and vulnerable, and he hadn't been there to stop it. How could I let this happen? He asked himself, feeling a sinking weight in his chest. The guilt gnawed at him, sharp and unforgiving. I failed her. Ethan's hands shook, but he fought to steady them. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, frustration, helplessness. He could feel the fury building inside him, that simmering anger that had been quietly waiting for the moment it could be unleashed. He could feel it now, like a furnace roaring to life, threatening to consume him. His heart raced, blood pulsing hot and fast through his veins. Jasmine had been humiliated in front of everyone. But worse than that, they had attacked her for no reason other than their own twisted amusement. These were the men he had once trusted to do the right thing, the men he had worked alongside, and they had betrayed that trust. Ethan drew a sharp breath, his hands moving to gently push Jasmine away just enough so he could look into her eyes. His expression was hard, his brow furrowed deeply. The calm demeanor of the police captain, the professional who dealt with danger every day, was gone. In its place was a father, a man who could no longer keep his anger contained. This was no longer just about enforcing the law. This was about protecting his daughter, and he would not stand by and let this go unanswered. His voice, when he spoke, was fierce, his words a low growl. No one is getting away with this. Not while I'm here. The words were quiet, but the weight of them hung in the air, heavy and certain. Jasmine, despite her tears, looked up at him, the intensity in his voice somehow comforting in the chaos of her emotions. She nodded slowly, not fully understanding what he meant, but she could hear the promise in his tone, the unyielding vow that this would not be forgotten, that someone would be held accountable. Ethan's anger, once simmering, now boiled over. He clenched his fists, the muscles in his arms straining under the pressure, but he didn't care. The pain he felt for Jasmine was something he couldn't ignore, couldn't suppress. He was a father first, and the injustice that had been done to his daughter ignited a fire in him that no longer felt contained. His mind flashed back to the first time he had held her as a baby, the first time he had vowed to protect her with every breath he had. Today his promise had been broken, but he would not let it stay that way. With every passing second, Ethan's mind raced. He had been a police officer long enough to know how the system worked, and he knew how things could be swept under the rug. But Jasmine deserved better than that. She deserved to see that justice was real, that when the world failed her, there was someone who would make things right. He had always taught her that, and now it was his turn to show her that he meant it. "I'm going to make them pay," he murmured, the words almost to himself, but his voice carried a dangerous weight, one that only a man desperate for justice could have. Jasmine could see the resolve in his eyes, the fire burning behind them. It wasn't the kind of anger that blinded you. It was the kind that made you see everything clearly, made you focus on what had to be done, no matter the cost. As he held his daughter, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The system would fight back, people would question him, maybe even try to silence him. But none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was protecting Jasmine, giving her the justice she deserved. No one, no matter their badge or their title, was above the law. And he would make sure they understood that. Ethan stood outside the fire station, his jaw set, fists clenched at his sides. The anger that had been boiling inside him since Jasmine's tearful recounting now surged to the surface. His daughter's pain had ignited something in him that could not be ignored. He was no longer the calm, controlled police captain. Today, he was a father on a mission to ensure that those who had hurt his daughter would face the consequences. As he approached the door, the laughter from inside the fire station grew louder, and the familiar sound only deepened his resolve. The firefighters had no idea what was coming for them. He pushed open the door, his presence commanding the room, and immediately, the chatter inside died down. The group of firefighters looked up, their eyes glinting with a mixture of cockiness and indifference. Firefighter 1, the one who had mocked Jasmine the most, let out a short laugh as he saw Ethan standing in the doorway. He wiped his hands on his pants, clearly amused by the sight of the police captain. "Oh, Captain Ethan, come to see us personally?" Firefighter 1's voice was dripping with mockery, but there was a faint edge of nervousness behind his grin. He had expected to avoid consequences, but now, it seemed like the reality of Ethan's presence was slowly sinking in. Ethan's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained calm, controlled. "I'm here to talk about what happened with my daughter. You're going to answer for your actions," he said, each word cutting through the room like a blade. His tone was steady, but the weight of his anger hung heavy in the air. Firefighter 2 snickered and leaned back in his chair, clearly trying to downplay the situation. "It was just a little fun, Captain. Your daughter's too sensitive," he said, his laughter still echoing through the room. But Ethan's resolve only hardened. His eyes darkened and his fists clenched tighter at his sides. "This wasn't fun," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This was cruelty. You humiliated her. You abused your position, your power, to hurt someone who trusted you." The words rolled off his tongue, each one weighing more than the last. The room fell silent for a moment, the firefighters exchanging uneasy glances, but the cocky bravado soon returned, and Firefighter 1 stepped forward, his smirk widening. "What's the big deal, Captain? You gonna take us to court over a little water?" He was taunting Ethan now, as if the entire situation was some joke to him. His stance was aggressive, puffing out his chest as though daring Ethan to make a move. But Ethan didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. "It's not about a little water," he said, his voice sharp with conviction. "It's about respect. It's about power and the way you abused it. You took it too far, and now you're going to answer for it." The tension in the room thickened, the mocking laughter falling into a heavy silence. The firefighters, sensing the shift, started to close in around Ethan, their eyes narrowing with hostility. One by one, they encircled him, stepping in closer, pushing him slightly as they did. Firefighter 2 smirked and took a step forward, his fists clenching. "What are you gonna do, Captain? You really think you can take us all on?" The group laughed again, this time with a more menacing edge to their voices. They were trying to intimidate him, to break his resolve, but Ethan was unmoved. His posture remained strong, his eyes unflinching as they circled around him. Without warning, the first blow landed. Firefighter 1 shoved him hard in the chest, knocking him back a step. The others followed suit, shoving, punching, and kicking, their anger and frustration spilling over. Ethan fought back instinctively, using his police training to defend himself. He blocked a punch, then landed a sharp elbow to one of the firefighter's ribs, sending him stumbling backward. But it was clear. They had the numbers, and they had no intention of stopping. The pain surged through Ethan's body with every hit, but he didn't give up. His focus never wavered. His mind kept replaying the look in Jasmine's eyes as she told him about what had happened. He had to do this. For her. Through the barrage of blows, Ethan gritted his teeth, his body aching but his spirit unwavering. "You'll pay for this," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "All of you. I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever." The firefighters hesitated for a moment at the intensity in his voice, their smirks faltering. They had underestimated him. They had thought they could break him, but Ethan was unyielding. Every punch, every kick only fueled his resolve. He was done with their arrogance, done with their mocking. This wasn't a game anymore, and he was going to make sure they understood that. As the attack continued, Ethan's mind was laser-focused on the bigger picture. He was in this fight for more than just himself. He was fighting for his daughter, for the justice that had been stolen from her. No amount of pain or intimidation would stop him from making sure the firefighters paid for what they had done. The chaos of the fight raged on, but in Ethan's mind there was only one thought: this ends here. As the news of the incident spread, it didn't take long for the community to react. Word of what had happened to Jasmine, how she had been humiliated and assaulted by the very people who were supposed to protect her, quickly found its way into every corner of the town. The once quiet streets were soon buzzing with anger, disbelief, and the overwhelming sense that something had to be done. Finally, members of the surviving community came together to offer their support. Sam Harrison tells us she was the only person to respond with something had to be done. People who had known Ethan for years, respected him as a police captain and considered him a friend, now rallied behind him and his family. The outcry was loud and immediate. Dr. Matthew Shelton and medical officer Emmett Sampson started a podcast calling for a reversal of Neil's medical trial. Ryan, Ethan's colleague and close friend, was one of the first to step forward in the face of the injustice. "We can't let this go unpunished," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "This is wrong on every level, not just because it's personal, but because it's a betrayal of everything we stand for. We need to make sure they pay for what they did to Jasmine." Ryan's words echoed the family matter anymore. Crying out was a matter of justice, one that affected everyone who believed in fairness and accountability. Meanwhile, Jasmine, though still hurting, found her voice in a different way. With the support of her father and the people around her, she turned to social media, knowing it was a powerful tool to make her pain heard. Her words, though simple, carried the weight of her experience and her refusal to let the incident go unnoticed. "They hurt me because of my dad," she posted, the words filled with both sadness and defiance. "But I won't let them get away with it." Her message resonated deeply, reaching far beyond just her friends and family. People began to share it, retweet it, and comment with messages of support. It wasn't just Jasmine's fight anymore. It had become a fight for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever suffered under the abuse of power. Her post went viral, and soon, it wasn't just the town that was talking about it. It was the entire region. The following days saw a surge of public outcry. Protests erupted outside the fire station, the epicenter of the community's anger. Signs were held high, demanding justice for Jasmine and accountability for the firefighters. The message was clear: the town would not stand by while one of its own was attacked, especially not because of her father's position. "Justice for Jasmine" echoed through the streets as dozens of people gathered, chanting the words with fierce conviction. No more abuse of power. The protests were peaceful but powerful. Ordinary citizens, some of whom had never been involved in any political activism, joined the cause. They stood side by side, united in their outrage, their voices rising in unison against the cruelty that had been inflicted on an innocent girl. Their support was unwavering, and it sent a strong message to those who believed they could get away with such behavior. The community would not let this slide. Jasmine, though overwhelmed by the attention, couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Seeing the support of her town, seeing how the community came together, gave her a renewed sense of faith in the world around her. It was the first time since the incident that she felt like justice might actually be within reach. The support didn't just come from strangers. It came from people who knew her, from neighbors, from classmates who had known her since childhood. It was their belief in her that strengthened her resolve. As the protests grew and the social media posts flooded in, it became clear that the firefighters' actions would not be brushed aside. The outcry was too loud, the demand for accountability too strong. The community was standing firm, and this time they would not let those in positions of power avoid the consequences of their actions. Jasmine's bravery in speaking out had sparked a wave of solidarity, and it was a wave that would not be stopped. The firestorm of public outcry forced the city council to take action. The demand for justice was too strong to ignore, and the investigation into the incident was launched with the full weight of the community behind it. It was no longer just about one girl's humiliation. It had become a matter of public trust, a challenge to the idea that those in positions of power could act with impunity. The fire station was under scrutiny, and the firefighters who had wronged Jasmine would have to face the consequences of their actions. As the investigation unfolded, the case quickly moved toward a trial. The courthouse was packed with spectators, some there to support Jasmine, others to see how the case would unfold. The public was watching, and the pressure to hold the firefighters accountable was palpable. Jasmine, though still feeling the weight of everything that had happened, found herself at the center of it all, standing up not just for herself, but for every person who had ever suffered abuse at the hands of those in power. In the courtroom, Jasmine was called to the stand. Her hands trembled slightly as she took her seat, but she looked determined. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her now. With her father seated behind her, watching her with quiet pride, she began to speak. "I was so scared," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "They laughed at me, sprayed me with water. They hurt me. Why would they do that?" Her words rang out clearly, each one carrying the pain of what she had endured, but also the strength she had found in herself to stand before the court and seek justice. The room fell silent as Jasmine spoke. Her testimony, raw and honest, painted a vivid picture of the torment she had faced. She didn't just recount the events. She gave a voice to the pain and fear that had been locked inside her since that day. The defense attorneys tried to undermine her words, to dismiss her experience as an unfortunate prank. But Jasmine stood firm. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a witness, a person demanding accountability. On the other side of the courtroom, Firefighter 1 sat with his head bowed. When it was his turn to speak, he seemed a shadow of the man who had once mocked Jasmine with such cruelty. The regret was visible on his face, and his voice cracked as he spoke. "I was wrong," he admitted, his words slow and regretful. "I didn't think about the consequences. I didn't think about how my actions would affect her or her family. But now I realize how wrong I was." He glanced briefly toward Jasmine, his eyes filled with remorse. His apology was too little, too late. But it was an admission of guilt that could not be ignored. The jury listened carefully, weighing his words as they considered the full impact of his actions. Ethan, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watched his daughter with pride. She was no longer the scared girl who had stood outside the fire station, trembling from the cruel treatment she had suffered. She had found her voice, and with it, she was not only speaking for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. His heart swelled with admiration as he saw the courage she displayed. She wasn't just facing down the firefighters, she was facing down her own fear, her own doubts, and showing the world that justice had to be more than just a word. It had to be a reality. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be many more hurdles, many more battles to fight. But today, Jasmine had already won. She had stood up for herself, for what was right, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan could see the strength in her that he had always known was there. She wasn't just his daughter anymore. She was someone who had shown the world what it meant to fight for justice. They headed home, leaving Jasmine behind. As the trial continued, Ethan knew this wasn't just about winning a case. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever have to go through what Jasmine had. And with her strength, they would change the course of their town, and perhaps even the way people thought about power, justice, and the responsibility we all share to one another. The courtroom was tense as the judge stood up, his robe sweeping the floor as he prepared to deliver the verdict. The moment had arrived. The months of public outcry, the protests, the trial, everything had led to this final decision. Jasmine sat nervously beside her father, her hands still trembling, but she felt a sense of anticipation in the air. The entire town seemed to be holding its chapter, awaiting the conclusion of this chapter. The judge cleared his throat, and the silence that followed was thick with expectation. "The defendants are found guilty of assault and abuse of power," he declared, his voice stern and unwavering. The actions taken by these individuals were not only harmful, but deeply disrespectful to the very ideals they were supposed to uphold. Their behavior toward a child, especially one so vulnerable, cannot be justified. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest. Hearing those words, "guilty," felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. For so long, she had carried the burden of the humiliation, the confusion, the fear. But now, justice was finally within reach. The verdict wasn't just a legal triumph. It was a moment of personal victory for her, a moment that validated her pain and showed the world that what had happened to her mattered. The judge continued, his tone firm as he addressed the consequences. "The defendants are hereby sentenced accordingly, including reparations for the emotional harm caused to the victim." The words sank in, and Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. She had hoped for justice, for accountability, but hearing it delivered so clearly and decisively was both overwhelming and deeply reassuring. The gavel came down with a sharp bang, and the courtroom erupted into applause. It was a slow start, hesitant at first as the community realized the weight of what had just occurred. But as the sound grew, it became a wave of support that filled the room, a resounding affirmation of what was right. Justice had been served, not just for Jasmine, but for everyone who had ever been harmed by abuse of power. Jasmine, still processing the enormity of the moment, looked over at her father. Ethan's face was a mix of pride and relief. He reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "You did it, Jasmine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed them what it means to stand up for what's right." The words, though simple, were a powerful affirmation of everything Jasmine had gone through. She had faced the worst of what people could do. But, in the end, she had prevailed. Not just because of the support of those around her, but because of her own strength. Her courage had carried her through the darkest moments, and now it had brought her to a place of justice. As they stood together, amidst the applause and the murmur of approval from the community, Jasmine felt a warmth inside her, not just from the validation of the verdict, but from the outpouring of support that had surrounded her throughout the entire ordeal. The community had rallied behind her, and now they had proven that justice, though sometimes slow, could still be achieved. The road ahead was still uncertain. There would be healing and there would be challenges, but for the first time in a long while, Jasmine felt the heavy weight of fear and shame begin to lift. The journey was far from over, but the victory in this moment was undeniable. The firestorm of injustice had finally been quelled, and in its place, a sense of peace began to take root. Days after the trial and the verdict, Jasmine found herself walking through the park, trying to find a sense of normalcy. The weight of everything that had happened was still fresh in her mind, but she felt a strange sense of peace settling in her chest. The community had rallied around her, and justice had been served. Yet, despite the sense of triumph, there was still a lingering uncertainty in her heart. As she sat on a bench, trying to gather her thoughts, she noticed a few familiar figures approaching her. It was the firefighters, the very same men who had once mocked her, who had humiliated her in front of everyone. The sight of them made her heart skip a beat, but there was something different about their demeanor now. They didn't walk with the same arrogance or cocky swagger. They were approaching her cautiously, their faces somber, their steps slow and deliberate. Firefighter 1 was the first to speak, his voice softer than it had ever been before. "Jasmine," he began, his words heavy with regret. "We were wrong. What we did was unforgivable, and we regret it deeply." He paused for a moment, clearly struggling to find the right words. "We've been through training, and we've learned how harmful our actions were." Jasmine's eyes met his, and for a brief moment she could see the sincerity in his eyes. It wasn't the same mocking look from before. This was different. They had done the hard work of reflection, of understanding the gravity of their actions. Firefighter 1's admission carried weight, but Jasmine wasn't sure if it was enough to heal the wounds they had caused. Firefighter 2, who had been standing off to the side, now stepped forward, his expression full of remorse. "We hurt you because of our own ignorance," he said, his voice low and regretful, "and I'm truly sorry." He didn't offer any excuses, didn't try to explain his actions away. His apology was raw, without defense, and Jasmine could hear the genuine sorrow in his tone. Jasmine sat quietly for a moment, the silence between them stretching out. She had expected anger, resentment, and perhaps even some kind of vindication after all that had happened. But what she hadn't expected was to find herself facing two men who seemed genuinely remorseful, who had come to terms with the impact of their cruelty. For a moment, she let herself feel the weight of their apology. It was important to hear it, to know that they understood the harm they had caused, but she also knew that forgiveness wasn't just something to be given away easily. Finally, Jasmine spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "I appreciate your apology," she said, meeting their eyes with a steady gaze. "But I hope you change, so this never happens again." Her words were simple, but they held the truth of her experience. She wasn't asking for an apology to make things right. She was asking for action. She wanted to know that the harm they had caused wouldn't be repeated, that their behavior would be transformed, so no one else would have to go through what she had. Firefighter 1 nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. "We will," he said quietly. "We'll do better. We promise." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for the first time, Jasmine could see that they weren't just apologizing out of obligation. They were acknowledging the change that needed to happen within themselves. Jasmine stood up, her heart still heavy, but her mind clearer than it had been in days. She knew that forgiveness didn't come all at once, and that healing took time, but this moment, this exchange, was a step forward for both her and the firefighters. It was a small but meaningful gesture of growth, one that left her with a cautious hope for the future. 5 years had passed since the day Jasmine had been humiliated by the firefighters, and in that time, she had grown into a young woman. The pain of those early days still lingered in her heart, but it no longer defined her. Instead, she had transformed that pain into strength, using her experience to fuel her desire to stand up for what was right. She had become a symbol of resilience for others who had faced their own struggles, proving that even in the face of the deepest injustices, there was always the possibility for recovery, growth, and change. On this particular day, Jasmine stood in front of a room full of students at her high school, a place where she had once felt small and vulnerable. Now, as she stood before them, the confidence she had gained over the years radiated from her. Her posture was strong, her voice steady as she prepared to speak to the assembly. She had been invited to share her story, not as a victim, but as someone who had turned her hardship into a platform for change. She took a deep breath, looking out at the faces in the crowd, and began. "We should never stay silent when faced with injustice," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "If I can stand up, so can you." The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of her words settling in. Then, slowly, the applause began. It was tentative at first, unsure, but as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, stronger. Jasmine's words had resonated deeply with her peers, and they understood that the courage she displayed was something they could also carry within themselves. As the applause continued, Jasmine felt a wave of pride wash over her. She had come so far from the girl who had once stood alone, trembling with fear in the face of injustice. Now, she was a young woman with a voice, one that was heard, respected, and admired. She had become a symbol of resilience, not only in her community, but in the hearts of those who had been inspired by her bravery. Standing there in the center of it all, Jasmine thought back to those difficult years. The memories of the firefighters' cruelty, the public outcry, the trial. All of it had led her here, to this moment where she could inspire others. She had fought for justice, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced by fear or oppression. "I've turned my pain into strength," Jasmine thought to herself as the applause finally died down. "And I'll keep fighting for what's right." The words echoed in her mind, a mantra that would carry her forward through whatever challenges lay ahead. She knew her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. But she was ready for whatever came next, because now more than ever, she believed in her ability to make a difference, the way Richard Powers had sung about. As the years passed, Ethan and Jasmine's bond only grew stronger. Together they had faced unimaginable challenges, and through it all, they had emerged victorious. The town had changed, and so had they. The fight for justice had not only shaped their relationship, but had also shaped their understanding of the world and their place in it. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their living room, Ethan looked over at his daughter, a small but proud smile on his face. The weight of their shared journey seemed to hang in the air, a constant reminder of the battles they had fought and the ones still to come. "It's what we did here," Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This fight, this victory, it's just the beginning. There's more work to do, but we'll do it together." Jasmine, now a young woman filled with hope, smiled back at him. Her journey had taken her through darkness, but she had come out stronger, more determined than ever. The fire that had once been sparked by her suffering had become an unyielding force of change. "We can make the world a better place," she said, her voice filled with unwavering conviction. "And I'll be there to help change it." As father and daughter sat side by side, their hearts full, they both understood that the road ahead would never be easy. The fight for justice never truly ends. It's a continuous struggle, a commitment to righting wrongs and ensuring that others never feel the weight of cruelty and injustice the way they had. But they also understood that they were not alone. The lessons they had learned, the strength they had found in one another, would carry them forward. The journey they had begun together had ignited a fire within them, a fire that would burn brighter with every step they took toward a better future. The impact of their fight would ripple through the lives of those around them, inspiring others to stand up, to speak out, to challenge injustice. The world was full of darkness, but Jasmine and Ethan had learned that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, change was possible. As they sat in the soft glow of the evening, the weight of all they had accomplished hung in the air. But there was something more, a quiet hope, a promise that the future could be different, that the power of one voice could be the spark that started a revolution. Ethan turned to Jasmine one last time, his voice soft but strong. "I'm proud of you, Jasmine, more than you'll ever know." Jasmine met his gaze, her smile radiant. "We've only just begun," she said, her eyes full of determination. "And I'll never stop fighting for what's right." The future, uncertain and challenging as it might be, no longer felt impossible. Together, they knew they had the power to change it. The echoes of their journey would last, not just for them, but for everyone who ever dared to challenge the darkness. And as they looked ahead, a single question lingered in the air. If we can change one life, one moment, one heart, what more could we do if we all fought together? The answer, though unknown, was one worth fighting for.